Geoffrey spent a lifetime in service to his country. Began in the military, served as and retired as a brigadier general. He spent time in NATO headquarters in Brussels, and then went on to serve in European Parliament as well, representing the UK. He's currently a Commodore in the British Empire and a distinguished fellow at the Gold Institute. Geoffrey, the floor is yours.
Eli, thanks so much. I wonder if we're putting the clock back not just 80 years, but certainly 30 years. And I mean, I remember, well, 30 years ago, I was indeed, in 1989, I was Chief of Staff and the Chief of the Military Intelligence Staff in the British sector of Berlin. When the wall came down and we saw the end of communism, at least in Europe. I mean, I didn't know at that time that just 2 hours down the road was a middle-ranking officer in the KGB called Vladimir Putin, who was the KGB man sitting in Dresden, just south of Berlin. 2 years later, I was at NATO headquarters in a senior military role, and I attended what was called the North Atlantic Cooperation Council on the 20th of December, 1991. And that was an outreach, really, to the countries of former Warsaw Pact, including the Soviet Union. They were all around the table. And about halfway through that meeting, the Soviet ambassador asked if he could be excused for a moment to take an important telephone call. And he left the room, came back about 10 minutes later and said, "I have an important announcement to make." And the Secretary General gave him the floor, and the Soviet ambassador stood up and said, "The Soviet Union no longer exists." Now, that was a defining moment. That was December 1991. And of course, then we got into this whole debate over the next 2 or 3 years over what many like to call NATO enlargement and indeed EU enlargement. I prefer to think of it not as a question of NATO pushing eastwards, but of responding to the desire of the peoples of Eastern Europe to join the West, the freely expressed desire of those people after years of oppression to join the freedom and what they hoped for was the prosperity that the West offered. And was it up to us to deny that possibility to those people? And so I think this is a fundamental point. Putin has raised this in his way. I'm raising it really in a rather different way, the opposite of the Putin approach on all this. I mean, we can all ruminate now about the, whatever mistakes and that might have been made over the last 30 years. I don't think this is the time to be doing that. We have to respond now to a problem that's happening at this particular moment. What's to be done? Well, I think NATO defense ministers are meeting at this very moment. I think all of the Western countries have responded extraordinarily well. I mean, even Germany with its peculiar coalition government is now saying it will at last upgrade its military capabilities and will also provide weapons for the defense of the Ukraine. In the slightly longer term, well, of course, we've got to address the deficiencies pretty quickly in our armed forces right across the alliance. I mean, we've been asleep at our posts as far as this is concerned. But I would say, I mean, that's going to take time, it's going to take money, but we need to start now. I would say very important, we need a more self-confident effort to influence public opinion. Our people are not ready for this. They've been shocked and surprised at what's happened. I mean, we're all sitting looking at these sorts of problems all the time, but for most people out there, this has shaken them out of their complacency and thinking, oh my goodness, you know, could we really go to war? And I think we need to explain, again, particularly to a younger generation, about the enormous benefits that we have from Western democracy and the market economy systems that we have in the West, and how that needs to be defended because it's very open to assault. We haven't yet, by the way, seen a mobilization of what I call the enemy within. You know, the sort of Moscow-inspired peace movements and all of these sorts of things, but maybe that some stage will come. Obviously, we don't want our people to live in fear, but we want them to have a better understanding of what it is that we're standing up. And we must break this habit we're into at the moment of just turning on ourselves and criticizing from within our own institutions and all that our histories and everything that we stand for. I think we've also got to appreciate that this isn't just happening in Europe. There's a sort of global battle for influence. I mean, we've talked for a long time, you know, years ago, Robert Kagan wrote about the future battle between the autocracies and the democracies. You know, we're now seeing this become more defined. And if we look around the world, there's a battle going on. It's not just happening in Europe, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in Asia, it's happening in Latin America. And we need to be up for the fight. We need to draw up an inventory of the countries in play, and we must win them back into the Western camp, whatever it takes. In particular, we need to reach out to what I would call the wavering friends. Now, I don't think Turkey's really wavering, but as you will all know, I've long talked about the need to get Turkey fully back on board, and Turkey could have played a more pivotal role in perhaps avoiding where we've got to in terms of this present crisis in the Ukraine. I think Turkey has a lot more to offer, and we need to help overcome some of these problems which have distanced Turkey too far from our Western institutions. We need Turkey fully back on board. That means to say we need to be more sympathetic to Turkish interests. What's happened to the UAE? How did that happen? They abstain in the UNS. I mean, this was a real marker, that UN Security Council vote. What happened to UAE? India represents a country altogether a different scale. India, we like to think, is firmly in the Western camp, but we have to understand that India has, for reasons we can all understand, a deep strategic alliance with Russia, because the West quite honestly failed India often in times of her great strategic need, and the only people she could turn to turned out to be the Vladimir Russians, and they are now the largest arms suppliers to India. But India needs to ask ourselves, who are we? Where do we fit into this? We are the world's greatest democracy. We attach great importance to things like human rights. We attach great importance to all the things that we in the West like to think that we stand for. And so, you know, work needs to be done as far as India is concerned. I mean, I hope that our diplomats around the world are working very hard to get those governments in far-off lands on side, so that the next time there's a vote in the United Nations, the whole world is saying to Russia, stop. But of course, we've got to say to Russia, stop now, because otherwise this thing can get completely out of hand. And goodness knows what the Ukrainian people are going to suffer in the next 48 hours or so. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Geoffrey. And I did notice, which is very interesting, that that President Zelensky spoke to the European Parliament and ultimately received a standing ovation earlier. So that's quite telling, considering the fact, considering Europe's relationship with Russia, and especially relating to energy. So thank you for your remarks, and we will definitely, I'm sure, circle back throughout this program. General Audino, it's graduated from West Point. He served multiple assignments in armor, cavalry, infantry, and striker units. Other key assignments included service as an Army Congressional Fellow in the U.S. Senate. His duty as an executive assistant to the Vice Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Director of Nuclear Support at the U.S. Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And to top off his stellar career, he is now a senior fellow at the Gold Institute. So without further ado, General Audino.
All right, Ellie, thanks so much for that intro. You'd asked me to talk about some of the military aspects of what we're seeing and what we might see in the future. So, for somebody whose first operational assignment was on the East German border, in the middle of the Fulda Gap, my classified position at that time as an armor lieutenant and with a cavalry scout platoon, there was no other U.S. unit between that platoon and the East German border. So this is of particular interest to me. If World War III was going to happen then, it was going to have to come through the Fulda Gap. So we have a generation of officers that grew up training against the Soviet threat, understanding the Russian threat, understanding the Soviet order of battle. And a lot of that we're going to draw on today. Our entire National Training Center and Combat Training Center complex in those days was built around fighting the Russians. And I can tell you that we kept a Soviet regiment, motorized rifle regiment at Fort Orden, California. Those guys fought 11 months out of every year, and every American unit, brigade level, at the brigade level and below, fought. Every operational unit fought there against this Soviet regiment, and they were highly trained. They wore Soviet uniforms. They fought on Soviet vehicles, and they used Soviet tactics, and that was as close to real combat as you can get. And so that generation of officers really learn an appreciation for maneuver warfare, and that's kind of how we look at these things. But, that's a long intro, but what I really want to focus on right now are three things. So first, you get into any discussion like this, you have to ask yourself, what is the vital national interest at stake? And we've talked before on a previous podcast that for the United States, it's an essential question, and it's an essential question for any nation in the West, and for Vladimir Putin as well, who is considering how much blood, treasure, and time we're going to commit to this. And I'll put this out there very plainly. The United States has always had a vital national interest in disrupting a unified political domination of the Eurasian landmass. To such a degree, this is serious enough, and to such a degree that the United States has 3 times entered Central Europe to prevent that from happening. 1917 we did, 1944 we did, and during the Cold War we did, and we kept significant combat power forward deployed during the Cold War to deter war, and it worked then, it'll work now. I'm not saying putting troops in Ukraine. We've got an insurgency there in the future, a resistance. Right now, we've got Ukrainian army that is fighting back and a resistance, both fighting valiantly, and they're fighting for their home turf. And with the object of war to break the enemy's will to fight, I just don't see the Ukrainians with their back against the wall losing their will to fight. I just don't see that happening, not now. Either case, with that on the table, I think there were two historical events that will help illustrate what we might be seeing here. First, believe it or not, is Ethiopia in 1935, the Italian adventure in Ethiopia. Now, Vladimir Putin has all kinds of strategic rationale behind what he's doing. First and foremost is to divorce the United States from its relationships in Central Europe. Vladimir Putin wants to drive a wedge between the United States and Central Europe. He knows that Germany is the center of gravity for Europe and has been historically. An entente, a geopolitical shift between between Frankfurt and Moscow, inevitably has the potential to bring with it the rest of Europe. He is sinking his energy levers deeper into Central Europe. Ukraine was part of that. Now he's shut that off. It makes Nord Stream 2 even more critical to Central Europe. Having said all of that, there's another element. In 1935, Benito Mussolini really saw himself as leading a resurgent Roman Empire, a new Roman Empire for the 20th century, the conquering Roman Empire of the 20th century. And if you see yourself as the champion of a conquering empire, well, you kind of need somebody to conquer. Enter Ethiopia. There was no geopolitical concession that the Ethiopians could have made in 1935 that would have prevented an Italian invasion. There was nothing anybody could have conceded. It was just going to happen because Benito Mussolini needed it to happen. So here we have, in the 21st century, of Vladimir Putin. He sees himself as the champion for past Russian glory, the resurrection of the glory days of the Roman Empire. And so part of this explains some of the mystery behind why is Vladimir Putin doing this. I really feel deep in my heart that those in the West who are looking for things we could have done differently and just recently about NATO membership and this, that, and the other thing, honestly, he was going to do this. And the only thing that would have deterred him was real combat power forward deployed. He had already made up his decision. All right. So let's talk about the second historical event that I think sheds light on what we're going to see militarily on the ground in the Ukraine. And that is Chechnya, 1995, 1996, and again in 2000. There essentially were three battles for Grozny. Chechnya is a country of 1.2 million people. When Russia entered Chechnya in 1995 and sought to seize Grozny, what happened? The Chechens in Grozny fought back. It was such a bitter and fierce resistance that the Russians were humiliated. When they entered Grozny in 1995, on the first day alone, they lost 20 to 26 of their tanks, 102 of 120 of their BMPs, their armored personnel carriers, and all of their ZSU 23-4. Those are the 23 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, very much needed in urban warfare, as tank turrets can't elevate high enough to engage the higher levels in city buildings. So it was brutal. The Chechens fought back. They hung Russian bodies upside down from the windows of defended positions inside the city. They decapitated heads and they lined them up across the streets. Now, I'm not saying that the Ukrainians are going to do this, but I am saying the Ukrainians will fight bitterly. Ukrainians will fight bitterly. There were booby-trapped bodies in Grozny. Mines became critical. Flame weapons, we see talk now about so-called thermobaric weapons being considered by the Russians today. Those are air fuel explosives. They disperse a fuel into the atmosphere, and then when it's ignited, it produces a large shoving effect, much different from a shattering effect of a high explosive. It's the sort of thing that topples buildings. The Russians experienced a heavy psychological and a physical effect. They failed to rotate their units quickly enough to relieve some of the stress on their invading units. They had very great difficulty synchronizing their operations.
Ernie, in general, it seems as though that we're seeing a lot, what you're describing now, we're seeing a lot of that now happening too in Ukraine. What you're describing in what you're describing from the Russian perspective in past engagements. So, but we're gonna let's come back. I know that we're gonna have a lot of questions regarding this, and I think to your point, I think that Ukrainians now have a more patriotic defense attitude than the Russians have in an offensive perspective. So thank you for your remarks. We have John Wallsteader. John is a senior fellow at the Gold Institute. His primary areas of expertise are national security, foreign policy, and especially continuing on his family's work of the work of Albert and Roberta Wallsteader. Especially, he focuses on nuclear proliferation and has done much work with myself, many members of Congress, and others in government with regards to missile defense. He's the author of Sleepwalking with the Bomb, which I highly recommend. John, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Elliot. I'd like to thank the first two presenters for setting a stage for discussing the nuclear issues and doing a great job of it. Because the first thing you think about is, why are we talking about possible nuclear exchange? And I would say that had we properly armed the Ukrainians even a year ago, mostly with the Javelin anti-tank system, which is the kryptonite, I think, in this one, the way the Stingers were in Afghanistan, because there they were shooting down relatively low-flying choppers. And here they have tanks were not that useful there. They're much more useful on the flat plains of eastern Ukraine. But with a 90% kill ratio, they've already inflicted an enormous amount of damage. And if there is somehow a victory, it will be a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians. They're not going to sell equipment so easily or think that their army is such great shakes after this. And that is the heroism of the Ukrainians, and we owe them a debt for that too. In any event, I'd say also there's another background. Much is made of the historic fears of the Russians of invasion. Well, Richard Pipes, the great historian, went over about 450 some years to the late to about 1980 of Russian history, and of 230 wars, Mother Russia started 200. So we can say that Mother Russia's neighbors have reasons to be nervous too. And I might add that the great invasions that are most spoken of, those from the Mongols, from the Swedes, from Napoleon's France and Hitler's Germany, came from distant powers. They weren't bordering. So we make too much of that and talking about sphere of influence to do what? As Geoffrey said, to do what? To oppress over 100 million people who hate the Russians, and with good reason. Now, on the question here of NATO preemption, here, the one thing is nuclear preemption. The one thing here that we have to be very concerned about is Vladimir Putin's mental state. I mean, we all knew he wasn't one of the world's sweet people, but there are some indications he's clearly physically diminished, and he shows some signs, at least to this lay observer and others, of also not being as mentally sharp as he was. He was caught off balance. He's hugely embarrassed. The good news, and I had occasion over the weekend to read a 2019 study by the Committee Non-Proliferation Studies called Finger on the Button. And the good news is you're never one push of the button from a nuclear war. There are various safety schemes. The United States and Russia both have what's called the presidential scheme. The president authorizes, but then there's a chain. It goes through several authorities before it gets to the launch thing. And the Russians have a lot of safeguards. Putin cannot start it on his own. And I think if there's an indication that he will start it, that the oligarchs they don't think that'll be too good for their bank accounts if even a single nuclear warhead is detonated in anger for the first time since 1945. And they will give, to borrow George Bush's term of endearment, Pooty Poot the booty boot, if they think he's going to do that. And I also say that there's not assurance that even the rank and file would carry out an order like that without anything showing some sort of strike. In 1983, there was this 5 missiles were reported as heading for Russia, and this one guy supposedly saved the world. He certainly saved a lot of people. He said he refused to go. He would not go without human confirmation. Unfortunately, it did not come through. The interesting thing there is, of course, that there's no way that would have been an authorized strike. If it's only 5 missiles, that's like Strangelove and a renegade general. In any event, missile defense, anytime you talk about nuclear matters, a lot of people have opposed missile defense. And one consequence of this is now that they got a real scare and they're worried, does Putin have all his marbles? You may not be able to deter someone like that. And missile defense is going to get a fresh look after this, I think. And Moscow's protestations will not be listened to. If they get a victory, it will be Pyrrhic because they've done enormous damage to their brand. There's no danger in any serious sense of a nuclear exchange. No European country, unless its own territory, well, there are only 2, the UK and France, neither of them is going to fire a nuclear missile unless there's a nuclear detonation on their territory. And as failing that, they're going to leave it to the United States and Joe Biden, as he has told our opponents, here are the infrastructure things we really want you not to strike, which of course will be their target list, has told them, don't worry about it. You know, you can have a minor incursion and we're not going to do anything. Instead of keeping the card, this is one thing Donald Trump doesn't get credit for. Donald Trump, you know, there was no territorial attempt by Putin. But appeaseniks like Obama and what we have now tempted Putin. And, you know, like Oscar Wilde once said, he can resist anything but temptation. And that's true of Putin. He's the wrong person to give an invitation to on that. We do have a stake in Ukraine. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994 is sometimes misrepresented by people who should know better as an effort to extend NATO. It had nothing to do with that. It was an effort to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine on the part of Clinton's America, Major's Britain, and Yeltsin's Russia, when he was at a time when presumably he was sober more than half the time. They may not have meant it, but Ukraine gave up the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, roughly comparable to the American and Russian arsenals today. They gave up a whole bunch of SS-18s, all those nuclear weapons. Anybody think that Putin would have seized any territory if they still had that? So if we don't live up to that guarantee, nobody else is going to, and that will trigger nuclear proliferation. It'll start with allies who realize that our extended umbrella no longer extends past Passaic, New Jersey, and Las Vegas or something. And on the other hand, that it's sauf qui peut now, in the absence of a regulating power. If Pax Americana disappears, we're not ready for Pax Sinica, fortunately, but we will have sauf qui peut, and then our adversaries will do that too. And that is a very likely consequence of this. I think that, you know, you cannot guarantee, of course, that there couldn't be an all-out war. Most of the assumptions, when you read or listen to the press, it's either no nukes or everybody launches thousands. People who study this over the decades knew that the bolt from the blue was the least likely form a nuclear strike would take. And that doesn't mean it's zero, but I mean, you don't have General Curtis LeMay today. We have a bunch of people who play around with pronouns. And then I would say, you know, Western appeasement has shown that it doesn't work with this. The appeasement of tyrants almost always winds up earning their contempt. And I remember Pat Moynihan saying in the Polish debt crisis of '82 and after the crackdown by Jaruzelski in Poland, although I can't find it, I think it was probably scrubbed out of the congressional record, because I was listening. I was down on the hill that year, and I was listening from upstairs, and he said, "We court great danger when we invite the contempt of totalitarians." And we have now in Biden someone clearly diminished mentally and physically, and a cackling loon of a vice president who's even worse. Argue that, assuming Putin is not going over the deep, that the greatest danger of a possible Putin move in the nuclear area is continued vacillation and gross incompetence.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I know that we have a lot more to cover on that, and I know we're going to come back. So thank you for your remarks. Moving on, playing cleanup, Joel Thayer, the president of the Digital Progress Institute. Joel has he's advised on legal and policy issues relating to antitrust, telecommunications, privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property, and the list goes on in Washington. But Joel, I think we're going to have, we now have a very this is a very important topic to discuss because we have experienced over the past number of years the cyber warfare that comes out of Russia, whether it's from government or from the civilian side. There's no doubt about it. This is going to play a big role. So I am eager to hear your thoughts on this, and I'm sure we all are. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. It's been great listening to all the panelists, and I think they set this up very nicely. And what I did enjoy was that the underlying current here was that Putin was going to do this anyway. And I think that if you look at it from just a cybersecurity perspective and what's been happening on the cybersecurity side, this is a well-known fact. It's clear from most of the folks in the cyber world that Russia and China included have been gearing up for at least some sort of pushback or some sort of warfare for the past 10 years. And you can see that just through some of their actions, but specifically related to Russia, I see it more as a three-pronged play from the cybersecurity end. And the three prongs are usually a combination of disinformation or the spread of disinformation. There's also the attack on critical infrastructure. And also there's a sense of data collection and spying and digital spying that occurs all throughout the net. So I'll take all of these in turn and stay well within that 7 minutes because I know that we are trying to be very conscious of time. So on the disinformation front, it seems as if Russia currently is really worried not about what the governments are doing, but what individual companies are doing, particularly American companies. So if you look at what companies like Signal provides, Signal is an encrypted service where you're allowed to text message, and it prevents peering eyes either from the company itself or anyone else. So part of the disinformation campaign that you saw out of Russia recently was that Russia was putting in, state-sponsored hackers were putting into the ether a level of doubt as to the encryption measures that Signal was going to take, and that it was actually hacked. And when in all reality, there was no validity to that argument whatsoever. And it seems as if Russia seems that their Achilles heel in terms of like their cyber play are these encrypted services. And again, I think encryption works both ways. It works as a great shield and also as a great sword. So, and this goes nicely into the attack on critical infrastructure. So we saw that as we get more and more, as more of our public utilities get more and more integrated onto the net, and we start relying more heavily on a lot of these services, you see that if you have an access point into that critical service, you can then control that critical service. So a great example of this, and one that's more Russia specific, is Colonial Pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline hack, where there was a bunch of cyber hacks that were oriented towards oil facilities and essentially trying to redirect and interrupt a lot of the exchanges that were happening in the oil markets, which completely shut down entire portions of the country's oil supply, when in all reality, there was no oil shortage. So again, this is another thing that that we have to think about in terms of cyber warfare, that it's getting far more intricate. It's getting more directed towards our day-to-day lives. This is not simply an email hack that gets where you get spammed for 24 hours. This could actually deter not just investments, but break down economies if it's used correctly. And it seems as if the Russian government is now becoming a little bit of a master in promoting these cyber attacks. The last bit, and I'm going to basically outline all of this as a holistic approach. The last bit is you see data collection or digital spying, and you certainly saw that in the SolarWinds attack. The SolarWinds attack was basically an over-glorified data dump that was given, or data siphoning that was given to folks in the Russian government. And the issue with having a lot of these centralized data centers or data services is that the information is all in one spot. So if SolarWinds was a huge government contractor with a lot of federal agencies, including that of, I think with the DHS, Department of Ed, list any American department, they probably had a contract with SolarWinds, not to mention all the other private enterprises that also dealt with SolarWinds. So essentially, all the Russian government did was put a set of malicious code into that algorithm and sat and just waited as the data started coming in. And what the benefit for them was like, well, now we have access to very intimate and very private email exchanges and even data exchanges. And as anyone I certainly defer to the good general on this, but the more data you have on your enemy, the more understanding that you have in terms of how they're thinking about cybersecurity, or even thinking about where they want to go next, basically gives you not just the leg up, but you win the war, because you can second guess. You don't even have to second guess. You will know exactly where they're going to deploy certain facilities. You are going to know exactly where folks get their oil, get their electricity, get their even communication service, and be able to jam it in strategic places. And I fear that the U.S. is falling behind a little bit on these on the cyber hygiene, mainly because we don't perform any real cyber hygiene when it comes to the government, and it's kind of the Colonial Pipeline and also SolarWinds exposed that American Achilles heel, and I think that Russia is simply waiting for all the sanctions to really go through on the American side before they really deploy anything. Because I am not of the mindset that Putin is a lunatic. I think he's very strategic, and I think that he's waiting for the Americans to show their hand, and then he'll attack. But he's not going to invite trouble beforehand. So I think that if this is a serious problem, if we don't at least somewhat protect our internal digital infrastructure, because frankly, that is a huge weak spot in America's national security. Sadly, as it turns out, we have also tried to manipulate other countries' public utility areas, and I say this, I say sadly, because frankly, we showed our hands to our enemies and where we're most likely to attack. The example that comes to mind is Stuxnet, and Stuxnet was essentially a American and Israeli operation in which we put in malicious malware into Iranian nuclear facilities to speed up fans, or essentially say that something wasn't reactive when it actually was reactive to break down all their nuclear infrastructure. And why I think that's interesting is that if we can do it, you can bet that Russia can do it. Mainly because if you look at all this level of if you look at this three-pronged approach holistically, you'll find out that through all the information that they've already gathered, they know exactly what our codes are. They know exactly where things. You have to assume they know exactly where things are. You have to assume that they understand how our nuclear programs work. Then you have the issue of actually attacking the critical infrastructure. What we saw in the colonial pipeline, where they are actually able to manipulate literal mechanics in those particular facilities. So, and then last is a bit of disinformation. Look, the worst thing that you can do in a war, and I've just read this really great book by Eric Larson, where he talks about how Churchill really had to get galvanized and essentially inspire hope that this was a winnable war to the general public. If you have social media companies that are getting hacked by disinformation services and cutting at the core of what it is to be American, what it is to be, what it is to fight for freedom, you are going to not have the public on your side and essentially allow a lot of things that would typically be viewed as against American interests. So I think that Russia's cybersecurity play is actually very sophisticated. I don't think it's simply they're going to hack into one pipeline and that's it. I think that they're going to do more of a holistic approach. I think they are going to, based off their level of them already being in our networks, the ability for them already to spy on all the things that we're doing, not just from an individual basis, but from a governmental basis. I think that they're able to understand what our critical infrastructure does and where it is and how it operates. And I also think that they'll be able to sell it to the American public as a good thing.
Joel, we ended off on, I guess, on a more lugubrious note than we began. So I think we have all that much more to be concerned about. But let me ask, I'm going to pose this question to Geoffrey and to John, and maybe you guys can answer it together as we're running short on time. John, you talked a lot about missile defense and the idea of what we need to do as we look to Europe, as NATO does. But let me go to Geoffrey first. And Geoffrey, as you listened to John's comments, what do you think the appetite of Europe and the Europeans are when re-evaluating missile defense?
Well, I've already commented on the need to win public opinion, to galvanize public opinion. This is one aspect of it. I think the other thing that we need to avoid is the idea that this is just an imposition of American power, if you like, in Europe. Because I'm not saying this would then be as like a mirror image. Of course it isn't, because there's no comparability. But that's an area that would be exploited by those within our own societies who seek harm to the United States, seek harm to the whole Western idea. So there's got to be sort of, we've got to have sort of ownership of a lot of this. And I think, there are one or two areas where we've seen the United States be very reticent to share some of its sort of technology, even with their very closest allies. I think of the F-35 system and the way that's developed. Even the UK, which is top of the list in terms of being integrated into that system, is still denied some sort of access. So I would say the important thing is this idea of ownership. And therefore, yes, there's got to be more attention to things like missile defense. And I think also related to this is what Joel's been saying about the vulnerability of our IT infrastructure. That applies not just, of course, to civilian infrastructure. That applies to military infrastructure in particular. And by the way, as an aside, I mean, I just wonder at this moment what scope there is for unattributable cyber action against some of these Russian offensive capabilities which are being deployed in the Ukraine at the moment. Because if we don't want to get involved physically in this war, but maybe there are other things we could be doing.
Thank you. John, anything to add?
Well, let me add very quickly. First of all, on the last point that Geoffrey made, I've seen reports, and my kid brother has Ukrainian contacts. He goes with a Russian girl. They know people who are over there and are stuck. That there have been two major factors, which is going to be the future face of war. One of them is Elon Musk having made Starlink available to the Ukrainians to substitute for communication. The other is there is a hacker group out there that has been disrupting the Russian communications too. Of course, this could happen to us if the war was in a different phase too. So you're getting more like Kriegspiel than chess, multi-layered chess games going on here, with actors being able to also pretend to be someone else, to alias themselves to do that. But I do think that nothing will get the public interested in missile defense more than the prospect, if they think that Putin is a madman. I don't think he's quite that, but if he does use even one, you won't find 5 people in the West who oppose missile defense the next day. This is a tectonic event. It's changing what they think they can get out of Moscow, what leaders are capable of, how ineffective a rules-based system is in trying to deter people who have contempt for rules. So in that case, and I think missile defense will get a boost from this. It temporarily got one after the Gulf War, except that the systems were too primitive then and for a number of other reasons. But I think you will see more interest in it. It will be harder to argue that arms control can handle these situations.
Thank you, John. We have a question from Soren Lang. I'm going to give this one to General Audino. General, do you see the Ukraine event as an isolated event or an event part of a much larger plan?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's a strategic objective here. Moscow's strategic objective ultimately is to displace the United States from its interests in Europe and to achieve a geopolitical shift between Frankfurt and Moscow and draw the rest of Europe with it. On a operational level within the NATO on the border with the Ukraine, I think if I was in Poland, I'd be concerned since Poland sits right along Central European plains. That is the highest speed avenue of approach into Central Europe. I think if I was up in Lithuania or Poland right now, sitting astride Kaliningrad, that is, the Russian enclave on the Baltic Sea, I think I would be concerned right there. Of course, any sort of Russian adventurism in either of those two directions would, of course, immediately invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter. So none of that is to be taken lightly. I do see that information operations are very important. Well, that's an understatement in itself, but I think Moscow right now is losing the information fight. And I think the Ukrainians are in fact winning this information fight. Russia lost the information fight during its operations in Grozny in the 90s. It's losing it here, and that's very important because as Moscow fails to get out its message, and we succeed in getting our message, not just here out in the West, but into the audiences in Moscow, in Russia, Vladimir Putin loses his own domestic support. That whatever he's got right now, and it appears he doesn't have as much as he would hope, all of that's at risk. And that's one of the 3 legs of the stool upon which you wage war. You've got to have the support of the population, the domestic support. That's the passionate component of a war effort. You've got to have the support of the government or the politics. That's the rational component. And then you've got to have the support of the military leadership. And that's the genius, the musicians of Mars. So you lose one of those legs and the war starts to go into disequilibrium.
Thank you, General. We have another question. I'm going to, Joel, let's give this one to you. Do the Russians begin using cryptocurrency now that they've been restricted from SWIFT?
Well, they've already have. So so again, the value of cryptocurrency is its encrypted nature, and encryption, as I said before, it can be used both as a shield and as a sword. When you saw that in the SolarWinds hack, when the hackers were trying to get a ransom, they wanted the ransom in cryptocurrency so as to not to be tracked. I do see that as the next war field, but I would like to actually respond in two parts to what the good general said and also what John was referring to in terms of Starlink. And this links back to, I think, relationships with China. And so as you see, Russia and its IT infrastructure is really based in Chinese infrastructure as well, with Huawei being a very significant player. Huawei is very interesting because going back to using encrypted measures, Huawei has middle boxes that can actually deflect a lot of VPNs and encryptions to basically show folks who they are and who's operating on the net. So that is where you have the interest of Starlink, where Starlink can provide that alternative, that market alternative for Ukrainians and Russians to both use encrypted service like Signal, encrypted services like WhatsApp to get messages across. And this goes back to what General Audino was saying, at least what I interpreted him to be saying, which was something when again, reading this Spun in the Vial, I feel like I'm on an Eric Larson book tour, but the big issue there is really the big issue that I think the general is referring to is getting a positive message out and getting it to the world. What is actually happening? You can't do that if you have a infrastructure that is built specifically for the state-sponsored government to promote things that they think should be promoted, to promote things that they think they should be promoted, which is why having private companies go out there and provide an alternative is a good positive message there. And I think if you want to use cryptocurrency, the coin flips both ways. It's not simple. Like if you want to enter onto a cryptocurrency market, it's not as, I think that it would be a failure of Russian understanding as to what cryptocurrency does. And in that I think they would overestimate how useful it is to advance their campaign when Americans can do basically the same thing and completely disrupt those different, those types of transactions. So will Russia use crypto? Absolutely. I'm not sure how that play out. I don't think it'll play out very well, and I don't think that it'll yield the fruits that they bear the fruits they think it will. I think that both John and General are right in terms of you're starting to see market players come in and basically provide alternatives to get positive messaging out that enforces this idea of American values, human rights, civil liberties, and I think that's ultimately one way of advancing this, one way of deterring a lot of like these Russian aggressive moves. But I'm sorry that detracted a little bit from the initial question, but I thought what the General and John brought up was just very fascinating and very good point.
Thank you, Joel. So we do have a couple more questions, but I do want to remind everybody to go to the Gold Institute website, goldiis.org. You can read more. I know John's writing a lot. Geoffrey is writing more about what's happening right now, and we're going to, all of that can be found on our website. And certainly, of course, without a doubt, you can also support the Institute via our website. Geoffrey, let me ask you a question. This one's coming from me. With all of the current events that we see happening in Ukraine, the general sentiment across the various different borders in Europe. Is this a boost for NATO or a boost for a European military, which obviously we've been taught, Macron, that's, Macron's dream is to have a European military. But is this a boost for one over the other, or it has zero impact whatsoever?
At the moment, it's a boost for NATO. And I'm pleased that at the moment, the messages we're getting from capitals are one of unity. But mark my words, if things settle down, then this whole question of European defense and European strategic autonomy will raise its ugly head again. But don't forget, the European Union sees every crisis as an opportunity to advance its own interests. So at the moment, things have dampened down. I hope people will get the message that it is NATO, and we've been talking for so long about the need to reinvigorate NATO. And I hope people will understand more that NATO is not just a United States institution. NATO is a United States and European institution, or a North American and European institution. And we all have our roles to play in this. So I hope they'll become great. But NATO needs to inculcate better understanding of all of that. But at the moment, the Europe thing's just done, but mark my word, it will come back, I'm afraid. When things have died down, they get talking about this. They say, "Oh, the hour of Europe has come. We need to stand on our own feet," and all this sort of nonsense. The strength of NATO is it engages the power of the United States and the power of the European nations in the defense of our democracies.
Now I'm going to pose this question to anyone who wants to answer it, but this is slightly off topic. So I'm using my moderator's prerogative here to do that, and that is, General Audino, John, Geoffrey, Joel, whomever it is who has a thought about this. Let us assume for a moment that last year Macron got his way, and you did have a European military. What would we be seeing right now versus what we see today? Ernie, you go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief, but it would have been the latest incarnation of the concept of a European rapid reaction force that has been percolating, popping up here and there over the years. But it's never been much more than, honestly, a light infantry based organization. And our light infantry have very specific roles, and they do those very specific roles very well. But the problem with a light infantry a light infantry dominated organization is that when you put it on the ground, it is literally the least lethal, the least maneuverable, the least survivable, and it provides the least amount of deterrent effect. Nothing since the invention of dirt has had more of a deterrent effect on the ground than heavy combat units for deployed. And there's just no substitute for that.
Yeah. Can I just add a point? Neither NATO nor the European Union have any armed forces of their own. The armed forces reside with the nations. The question is, under what alliance structure do those nations work together? Is it under the NATO structure, or is it under an EU structure? So that's actually what it comes down to. And I think people need to understand that.
Yes, and excellent. We have one comment moving up here. We have a comment from Mike Pavlotsky. China has an interest in a weakened Russia as an entry into Siberia. Geoffrey, you're nodding, so I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, China's interesting at this moment. You know, they've just come out with this statement. They want to see themselves as some sort of peacemaker in all of this. They regret the loss of civilian life and all the rest of it. Yeah, I mean, China's not ready to take on the United States. And so they're biding their time, and they don't like these other potential disruptions that are going on at the moment. China's biding its time, and it wants everyone to think that it's a nice power. So that's the way we want to look at this. At this moment, if China's saying, yeah, come on, we don't approve of what Russia's doing, that's all grist to the mill.
John? John, while you're answering this question, go on to the next question I'm going to ask you, which is, does this help or hurt China's intentions on Taiwan? So you can answer this and move into the next.
Well, I would say that China and Russia are, this little bromance is not long that it's going to last, but it can have impact in that relatively brief time. I think the showing of the Russian military does not impress the Chinese very much either. But on NATO, the biggest disincentive to a NATO led by the United States is an administration vacillating and incompetent as the one we have now, let alone if, God forbid, the vice president gets in. If we get a real leader in there, it's a debate to have. In some respects, Macron is 60 years after de Gaulle decided he wanted an independent force to prop a nuclear. He pulled out of NATO when it was 35 years before they came back in. And I think Iran, so that is a theme that's been around for a while. And here, though, I think the Europeans got a scare because they know that Biden isn't going to do very much. And they've all stepped up. I mean, look, when you get Switzerland abandoning neutrality, even verbally, when you get Sweden and Finland telling the Russians, you know, go flipping the bird to them, they have really been scared straight for a time. And I think this is going to be a big factor. Now, on China, Taiwan, if this thing ended well for Russia, it would have been a very large incentive for the Chinese to try something at Taiwan. If this ended with a major conflict where the United States was drawn in, I doubt we could fully project enough power. Even we'd have difficulty projecting into Europe, let alone simultaneously be able to cover over in the Western Pacific, even though that's primarily not a ground force thing there. Those carriers, some of them might be called back. We have one carrier right now that's looking for an F-35 at the bottom of the ocean out there. We don't have the same backstop that we had. On the other hand, the Taiwanese at this point have a better argument for saying, look, we're not asking for you to fight for us any more than the Ukrainians are. Just give us some more porcupines to stick the Chinese with if they try it. It's not a slam dunk for them to do that. And the reaction to Russia's nuclear threat also tells the Chinese, you better be very careful about making threats of that kind. They've done it in the past. I think it's a much tougher road for the moment for them, but we still have to see how this winds up. I believe the most likely thing is a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians. They'll get something they can take home. The oligarchs will not let Putin go completely nuts. And if he doesn't get a solid victory, if their prestige suffers, Putin might want to consider getting on one of those Elon Musk flights to Mars or something, because he won't be long. I don't think, if they don't get a solid victory here, I don't think Putin lasts. And that'll be a message to the Chinese that if they try something, Xi Jinping will know if he's not successful and he tries something, he's not going to last either.
Okay, so let's. I appreciate everybody's participation. I'm going to end on a very elementary, but I guess thoughtful question, which is, and I'm just going to go around one-word answer. Russia, Ukraine, win, lose, or draw. Geoffrey.
We've got to give Russia some way out.
That's a political one-word answer. Joel.
I think draw.
Draw. John.
Pyrrhic. Pyrrhic victory.
All right. General. Ernie.
Russia wins Donbass and nothing else.
Okay. I thank everybody for joining us. Once again, I ask everybody to visit goldiis.org. That's our website. Take a look, see who we are. If you haven't done so already, feel free to support us, and we will continue these conversations as this conflict continues. And I look forward to seeing everybody on our next call. Thank you very much.